I'm Greg Wheatley, and my guest today is Dr. David Setran. Dr. Setran is professor of Christian formation and ministry at Wheaton College, author of a number of books. I'll mention his last two, his most recent two, Spiritual Formation in Emerging Adulthood, a practical theology for college and young adult ministry. And then just before that, not too many years before that, College Why, Student Religion in the Era of Secularization. And by the way, Dr. Setran is a graduate of Wheaton College. So, Dave, I think that's a good place to start. You came back.
I did, yes.
Welcome. It's good to have you here.
Must have liked it.
Yeah, exactly. And they liked you, too. Yeah. But when you were here as an undergrad, you were a biology major.
Right.
How does one get from the biology lab to Christian formation and ministry?
Yeah, well, it was certainly not a straight path necessarily, but had a wonderful experience as an undergrad here at Wheaton in the late 80s and early 90s, and very much appreciated my biology training. I found that when I got to my junior and senior years, my appreciation and love for ministry was beginning to grow, actually through some Wheaton programs that I was a part of here. The Office of Christian Outreach, very involved in tutoring ministries there. Also spent a summer overseas in Africa, teaching in Bible schools and doing some other things like that, and just found that love for ministry and for teaching growing. And yet I was a senior and realized that
hard to start all over.
It was a little bit challenging to start over at that point. But I went right from the undergrad into the master's program here at Wheaton in Educational Ministries. And it was one of those experiences just finding out as I started taking those classes, this was for me. It was a perfect fit. Yeah. Exactly. Yeah. And so I studied under a Wheaton professor, Lyle Dorsett, who had been here during my time. And he was the one who encouraged me to kind of move forward and go on for PhD work and eventually to begin teaching in this area.
Nobody quite like Lyle, is there?
Lyle was very persuasive, very convincing.
Quite a guy.
Wonderful mentor.
So was there a certain amount of angst in that, or was it just sort of a smooth transition? I mean, that's a big corner to turn,
right,
when you've banked your education on biology.
Absolutely. And there was angst. Certainly, I think there were quite a few people who wondered why I was making the shift. I had been doing very well in biology, was heading either to med school or maybe on to PhD work in biology. And, it was very much prayer, again, mentoring from some professors here, very supportive parents who, helped me to know that if this is what God was calling me into, He would provide the way. And like I said, once I got into that first semester, it was very affirming and confirming that this was the right place for me to be.
And along the way, you've done some youth ministry, I think. Is that correct?
College ministry, mainly. And so I did spend a year doing an internship here at College Church in Wheaton. That was part of my graduate program. But then when I went on to do my PhD at Indiana University, pretty much the entire 5 or 6 years we were down there, I was also helping on staff at a church doing collegiate ministry for the students at Indiana University.
Let's talk then. That's a nice segue into what clearly is one of your passion areas, and this whole idea of spirituality or formation in the emerging adult.
Right.
We should probably start, that emerging adulthood is a relatively new label, isn't it?
Yes.
What do we mean by that?
Yeah, so developmental psychologists have begun using that phrase to describe roughly the period between age 18 and the late 20s. And part of that is as a way of explaining something they feel is a new phase of life because of some cultural changes in American culture, but also in Europe, other places where many of the traditional milestones of adulthood, whether it's getting married, finishing your education, becoming financially independent, all those things are being delayed into the later 20s. And so there's not that ready shift from, college to job to marriage. There's a more extended period that's a little less distinct, a little less scripted than it used to be. Yeah. And so they're calling it emerging adulthood. Not quite an adult, but beyond adolescent.
Yeah. And I think a lot of people on a practical level can relate. I mean, kids are staying home or coming back home more than they used to.
Exactly.
Sometimes to parents' delight,
yes.
sometimes not.
They'll call that the boomerang effect. Yeah,
but it's true. It's out there, isn't it?
Yeah.
So, Dave, how does that impact or how does that interface with spiritual development?
Right.
What did you find?
I think a lot of what the book is about and what we found in researching this, most sociologists, so Christian Smith, some other people have written about how this time period becomes the very low point of spiritual development for most people. And it's not only church attendance that's fairly popularized in terms of people's understanding of that as the black hole in the church, but even spiritual practices, prayer, Bible reading, evangelism, a feeling of closeness to God, those kinds of things are all kind of hit their low point in this period of time. And there are a number of reasons for that. I think obviously these delays of adulthood make it harder for people to get connected to a faith community. It's also true that I think in American culture in particular, this time of life of emerging adulthood gets defined a lot of times as the one period of freedom, of you're outside of your parents' supervision, but you're not yet responsible for others. And so most people want to see it as this is my time to explore, to do what I want. Those other things, the sober responsibility that comes at a later time can be put off till later, postponed. Yeah. Right. And so for many, they see this as a kind of open window to be free of those things, even the way they'll talk about marriage as a ball and chain, and they want to avoid the responsibility that comes with those things. One of the things we tried to point out in the book is that it's very hard for people to say, okay, I'm going to just do what I'd like during this phase. And then maybe when I turn 30, I can just flip a switch and become that godly, responsible adult that I was hoping to be. So many patterns are being formed during that time. Habits are being generated. It's not just what happened in my 20s stays in my 20s. It's that these things continue to affect you.
So that clearly
that
the challenge there for people who minister to that age group is huge.
Absolutely.
Because as you said, if these patterns are being cemented, that's a window that's critical.
That's exactly right. And there's so many important things that happen, obviously, in this phase of life in terms of choosing a vocation.
And I assume, Dave, that you're talking about young people who have not. You're not talking about people who have grown up as pagans. You're talking about people who have been church, grown up in Christian families.
That's right.
And then enter this sort of no man's land of non-responsibility, right? Yeah.
That's right. And so many people cite statistics anywhere from 50 to 70% who grew up in the church all the way through, say, youth group and teenage years, leave the church for at least a year during this time. And I think some people have a very laissez-faire attitude toward that. They say, well, they'll come back eventually once they get married or something like that. But again, when you recognize all the major decisions of life that are happening at that time, all the habits being formed, it's a pretty formative time of life. And if they are being formed spiritually, how is that happening outside of a congregation or outside of a faith family of any kind?
So let's talk a little bit about, and we've touched on this part a little bit, what's caused that maybe sociologically or culturally, and then more importantly, what are you saying to people? How do we minister to that age group?
Exactly, and I think part of it becomes, and none of this would be completely rocket science, but the importance of mentoring for this age group in particular becomes so critical, partially because we describe in the book a kind of loss of a mentoring fabric in the culture. That's true of the family. I think many parents consider once they hit 18, my job is done. They can move out from that point. I shouldn't be giving them advice anymore. Churches are very good sometimes at segregating out all the different groups so they're not finding any contact with those in older age groups. Even higher education institutions that back in history certainly used to be very given to mentoring. I think you don't find much more of a specialization aim, not much of a in loco parentis sort of taking care of students kind of aim now. And so part of this is that I think people in this age group need to see examples of those who have lived a little further on in life, who can show them that, yes, developing these habits really does lead to a life of fulfilling Christian service. They need to see those examples out in front of them. I think churches also need to find ways to do a better job of giving some of these emerging adults responsibility within the life of the church. I think a lot of times pastors, others might see these 18 to 25-year-olds as transients, as people who aren't going to contribute much to the church at that time. But I think if we can begin to give them a sense that, no, this is your church. You have vocational responsibility even here to play a part in this. They will feel much more part of the congregations as well. A lot of people will say churches are so given to the family, really taking care of the family. And since a lot of these students aren't married yet, they might feel as if it doesn't have much for them.
Slipping through the cracks.
That's right.
Yeah,
that's right.
I can imagine that in your role here at Wheaton, it seems to me you could be both ministering to students who are themselves in that's right. very moment and helping them learn how to minister when they go out of here. I mean,
that's
you
exactly right.
feel like you have sort of a dual role?
There is a little bit of that. I teach a class in college in young adult ministry to college students and young adults. And so they are in the very position of the things that we're talking about. So I do think many of them feel it's actually helping them to better understand themselves spiritually and where they're at, but also giving them a platform, hopefully, to say, okay, I want to make sure that those coming up after me don't fall into these same traps. Yeah.
One of the other things that I know you've done research on really caught my attention. You looked at family Christian nurture among the Puritans.
Yes.
I'm sure that relates, what you found there probably relates to the things you're trying to talk about and teach now.
Absolutely.
What was going on with positive? Or were there was it negative? I'm assuming we say Puritans, we usually think they had it pretty right.
Right, and part of this, I'm actually on sabbatical right now and have been doing a lot of reading of Puritan sermons in particular. So pastors talking about the ideal family and how to raise children in the faith and things like that. Cotton Mather in particular over the last few months. And, something that attracted me certainly to them right from the outset was the intentionality. And Puritans are known for their purposefulness, certainly. So Mather, for example, talked a lot about comparing family Christian nurture to what he called the family sacrifice. He said, just as in the Old Testament, you would see fathers in particular kind of leading their families into the sacrifice, that parents now are supposed to be doing the same kinds of things. And so offering our prayers and our praises to God together as a family, morning and evening family devotions as a staple, sort of a non-negotiable, like we would consider brushing our teeth probably. It was just a very regular affair, and they did it so that there would be that kind of rhythm of family life that every morning was thanking God for his new mercies every morning, leading out into his faithfulness through the day, and every evening coming back and repenting of known sins through the day, and almost as if each day they're enacting, the mercies of God in the morning, the forgiveness and redemption of God in the evening, and just that set up their whole style of living.
It really is a rhythm, as you said.
It is,
Yeah.
very much so.
I can hear people saying now out there saying, okay, now come on, Dave, that was then.
Right.
And we live in a hectic 21st century rat race.
That's
You're
right.
telling me I'm going to have what we call devotions with my family twice a day?
Right. Well, and certainly one of the things you'd find as you look about the changes from then to now would be just the lack of time, obviously spent in one another's presence as a family. So not only formal schooling and things like that, but also just the kinds of schedules that children keep in our contemporary society. One of the things I found also very compelling as I've read, they did have this need for formal devotional time together as a family that included Bible, included singing, it included typically some catechism training, things like that. But they were very given to the informal kinds of teaching and training in the midst of life
Kind
as
of the
well.
as you walk by the way part.
Exactly. And I think, if anything, that's also compelling for our contemporary time. Mather always intrigued me because he had spiritual teachings that would be part of almost every life activity. So we're starting a fire, we remember that we need to burn brightly for the Lord. We see the clock and we recognize that our time is short. And he said even as children would engage in their games or sports, that he was trying to make connections to spiritual kinds of activities. Sickness, which was obviously a very significant aspect for them. Can we find ways to talk about what he called the analogous spiritual distempers of their soul at the same time as we deal with their sickness? So it was really not only these formal times, but also informal moments that they could find.
What about, just a couple minutes left here, what about the contemporary church youth group? Now, obviously they vary, but
Sure.
on average in America, the youth group kind of takes on a similar kind of cast.
Right.
How are we doing with that? I mean, that's a little younger than the group you're talking about, but
No, sure. And I think in some ways, and Puritans actually at times worried that families would begin to kind of offload their spiritual responsibilities to the church and to the congregation, which I think is still an issue now. But I do think, what youth groups are obviously attempting to do is to consider, again, a very formative time of the lifespan and to engage people together on issues that are going to be of great importance to them. Now, I do think the Puritans might challenge that a bit by saying, sometimes when you're only together as peers and in a peer culture, you do lose some of the experience that comes from older mentors. Mather was often worried about packs of youth together and sort of the blind leading the blind kind of aspect of things. Now, lots of youth groups obviously have adult leaders and shepherds and helpers in that way. But I think that's something that they would point out is, they're segregated in school, they're segregated in the church. Where are those places where we're going to find places to be together with adults who are showing the way, the
mentoring.
path? That's right.
Yeah.
That's right.
Dave, it's great to have you here. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much.
It's been fun to get to know you. Let me mention most of what we've talked about here you'd be interested in Dave's book called Spiritual Formation in Emerging Adulthood, a Practical Theology for College and Young Adult Ministry. You'll find that online. You can look at Amazon or just do a search for that. Dr. David Setran is Professor of Christian Formation and Ministry at Wheaton College. And as well, you can get to know more about that department. Maybe you're interested for yourself or for a student of yours. Go to wheaton.edu and look up the Christian Formation and Ministry department. For Inside Wheaton, I'm Greg Wheatley.